We're pleased to have with us Haviv Rettig from the Times of Israel. For those who don't know him, he's an excellent writer. It's always a pleasure to read his very insightful and very well-written articles. And I think we're very privileged to have him tonight to talk about the issue of judicial reform / overall in Israel. We decided to talk about this issue this evening or this morning for some of you, because as you know, besides of course the very tense security situation which David mentioned, besides this, of course, one of the most heated debates today in Israel and controversies is about the new government's plan to deeply reform and overhaul the judicial system. And we thought it would be important to explain to our people in FELNET, our supporters and friends, what the controversy is about. As a bipartisan and non-political organization, FELNET is not taking sides in political controversies, and of course we're not taking side in this controversy either, but I think it's important for people to understand what the debate is about, what the plan is, the government's plan is, what the opposition is suggesting. So what I'll do is give you for a few minutes, I'll give you a general background about Israel's constitutional debate, if you like, and then we'll start a conversation with Haviv, who will be also asking me a question to direct the conversation, and at the end we'll take questions from the audience. So I would start with the fact that unlike the United States, Israel does not have a written constitution. There are many reasons for that. When Israel proclaimed its independence in May 1948, there was talk, of course, of writing a constitution. We never had the equivalent of the Federalist in America, of years of debate on how to conceive and write the ideal constitution. We never had that. What we had was a Jewish population in British Palestine fighting for its survival, fighting for its independence, and therefore the struggle, the military and diplomatic struggle for Israel's independence took precedence on everything else. And therefore the project of a written constitution was pushed off. And generally when things are pushed off in Israel, they're actually pushed off forever, which is what happened. And then of course, once Israel became independent, there were too many disagreements among political parties about what the constitution should look like. David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, also argued at the time that you needed more Jews to live in Israel in order to proclaim a constitution for the Jewish state. But the bottom line is that we never had a constitution. Instead of that, first of all, we inherited British common law, as well as Ottoman and Turkish law. But with time, besides inheriting the British common law, we also passed basic laws that basically regulated the powers of the parliament, of the government, of the president, etc., etc. So those basic laws basically can be, in a way, compared to a constitution, but they were never actually declared officially a constitution. So as I said, most of those basic laws had to do with the separation of powers, about the powers of the judiciary, of the executive and the legislature. And then in 1992, the Knesset passed two types of basic laws on human rights and freedom of activity and occupation, of professional occupation. Now, these were not about, the powers of the three branches of government. It was a kind of the equivalent of a Bill of Rights, the basic rights in Israel. And that is when the Supreme Court, mostly under the leadership of Justice Aaron Barak, declared kind of unilaterally what he called himself a constitutional revolution, saying that those two basic laws completely changed, in his opinion, Israel's constitutional law. And then in his decision, first of all, it started under his predecessor, Meir Shamgar, at the Supreme Court, but also Aaron Barak became very active, I would say. His judicial activism reached new levels. So very briefly, what did he do and which kind of decisions did he make that changed the separation of powers in Israel and granted more powers to the court? Again, this was never discussed publicly. There never was a public debate or a basic law or a constitution about where exactly is the dividing line between the Supreme Court, the government, and the Knesset. So basically, I would say that in his court decisions, Aaron Barak made four main changes. First of all, he basically canceled the principle of standing. Anybody now under Barak could petition the Supreme Court, even if you were not directly affected by a government decision or legislation. It used to be that the Supreme Court rejected petitions from people which it deemed unrelated to the topic of the petition. This is no longer the case. Then it used to be that the court would only receive petitions on legal matters, proper. Just to give you an example, when Israel and West Germany established diplomatic relations in 1965, the first ambassador that was appointed by the Federal Republic of Germany had served in the Wehrmacht, and therefore a lot of people in Israel were offended. So they petitioned the court saying, you cannot let this guy serve as an ambassador. The answer of the court was like, we understand your pain, but this is not a legal matter. It has nothing to do with us. Have a good day. It's no longer the case. Aaron Barak introduced the principle that everything is justiciable, that you can bring anything to the court, even if it's a political matter, the court will look into it. Then he also introduced the principle of reasonableness, that if a decision is deemed unreasonable by the court, a government decision is deemed unreasonable by the court, then the court can strike it down if it deems it unreasonable. And then finally, he also decided that the opinions of the Attorney General would not be mere opinions, but would be binding. So basically, any advice published by the Attorney General would become a binding decision and binding the government. He made those four changes, and then the court was petitioned. Just to give you an example, I mean, today, last week the court decided that Aryeh Deri is not fit to be minister in the government and ordered the prime minister to fire him. But this happened already in 1993. So this guy has been around, in Israeli politics for 30 years, being fired by the court and not by the government. But just to show you how the decisions of Aaron Barak turned into a new type of separation of power. Already back then in 1993, Aryeh Deri and his minister, another cabinet member from Shas, and at the time Shas was part of the coalition of Yitzhak Rabin, Aryeh Deri had been indicted for fraud. By law, he did not have to be fired or resign at the time because he hadn't been convicted yet. So the prime minister needed Shas, Yitzhak Rabin at the time needed Shas in the coalition, and decided, I'm not firing him because he's been indicted, but by law, I don't have to fire him, and I need him in my coalition. Immediately, the court was petitioned by a civil society organization. There was no more standing, so this civil organization could petition the court, even though it was not affected by it. The decision was not illegal, but Aaron Barak said it's not reasonable. It was, and then of course, the prime minister said in court, well, I don't want to fire him and I don't have to fire him. And Aaron Barak said, well, your attorney general thinks otherwise. The attorney general says that he has to be fired, and the opinion of the attorney general is binding, and I don't care what you say, you the government, because what is important is the attorney general. So you see here how this, what Aaron Barak called a constitutional revolution, completely changed, I would say, the balance of power between the judiciary and the government. And then finally, in 1995, Aaron Barak, the court was petitioned, and Aaron Barak wrote in his decision that the court had the power to strike down legislation that it deemed unconstitutional, which it's an expression that surprised many people in Israel, since Israel does not have a constitution. But then he said, well, we do have a constitution, you just didn't realize it. All the basic laws that have been passed by the Knesset altogether constitute a constitution. And by the way, it's fine, like the court, in most democracies, the court has the power to strike down legislation, right? But this was never discussed. It was never decided by the legislator either. So basically, you've had a complete change of balance of power between the branches of government, a constitutional revolution proclaimed by the court itself without any public debate. And with time, this became a right and left issue, because let's say that most judges on the Supreme Court were mostly liberal. And since the collapse of the Oslo process, let's say that the right has been in power most of the time in Israel. And therefore, what happened with this constitutional revolution is that whenever a government would pass legislation, the opposition would immediately rush to court to strike it down. And then it became a right and left debate, because people on the right say, hey, we keep winning elections and then you steal them from us by striking down our legislation with your liberal judges. What kind of a nonsense is that? So this is why it became a right and left issue. By the way, like in many countries in Western democracies, such as in Europe, you also have a right and left issue around this kind of topics. Now, and I'll end this and then I'll open the discussion with Haviv. This whole constitutional revolution proclaimed by Aaron Barak just took place without, as I said, any public debate. It just happened quietly. And eventually it became a public issue and a public debate. It became also, as I said, very much a right and left issue. And the current coalition, which is probably the most right-wing in Israel's history, has a lot of people who've been talking about it. Yariv Levin, for example, the Minister of Justice, has been talking about his, I would say, his criticism of the constitutional revolution, how the court unilaterally took all those powers over the years, et cetera, et cetera. And he's coming up with those proposals. But even though, as I said before, it's become very much a right and left issue in Israel, the proposals that are presented by the current coalition are not supported by all of the right, far from it. And that's important to understand. You have a lot of people on the right who've been very critical of the judicial activism, say, hey, you guys are going too far. That's not what we want. They say, we want a reform. We think there's a need to rebalance the powers between the judiciary and the government, but what you guys are doing is basically, instead of establishing or reestablishing some type of balance, you are replacing one imbalance by another one. Because instead of having basically, what the right has been saying is that instead of a separation of power, we have a hierarchy of power where the Supreme Court always has the last word. And now we're going to have, if according to a lot of people on the right, is that if we're having those reforms proposed by Levin, we'll have a hierarchy of power when the executive will be on top all the time and the court will have no powers, because basically what Levin is proposing, the Minister of Justice, is that, first of all, the judges will now be basically appointed by the government, right? And not for life. Like in America, they're appointed for life, and sometimes you appoint a conservative judge and then they make decisions that are more liberal, and the opposite. And in America, you have a written constitution and a Bill of Rights, so they would not be appointed for life, and then the Knesset would be able to override a decision of the Supreme Court to re-legislate with a simple majority of 61. The court basically would no longer be able to strike down legislation because they would need a majority of 15 judges out of 15. And so basically a lot of people on the right, such as Dan Meridor or Benny Begin or Gideon Sa'ar, say, no, this is what you guys are doing is not establishing a new balance, is replacing one imbalance by another one. And that's what the controversy is really about. Just one last word. There have been, I mentioned Gideon Sa'ar, who's a former Likud minister and who was Minister of Justice in the outgoing government. And so he actually implemented reforms in the judicial system. Just to give you one example, the appointment of judges in Israel, judges are appointed by a committee made up of judges, of members of academia, there's a lawyer of the Lawyer Association, members of the opposition and of the coalition, and a Minister of Justice. Now, it used to be, until 2008, that de facto, the judges had a veto on this committee because they had 3 judges and they always had a coalition with the representative of academia and of the Lawyers Association. What Gideon Sa'ar did with his legislation in 2008, he said that out of the 9 members of this committee, you need a majority of 7, which basically canceled this veto. And today you have to reach a compromise between all the members of the committee. That is a good reform that has enabled other Minister of Justice to appoint a more diversified court, when today you have a more balanced makeup between liberal and conservative judges. This is an example of a reform that has established a balance. But somebody like Gideon Sa'ar today said, I'm completely against what Yariv Levin is trying to do, because he's not trying to do an evolution, but a revolution. So this is in a nutshell what the controversy and the debate is about. I took a little bit more than 10 minutes as I had planned, but I'll end here and we'll start the conversation slash question with Haviv.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I think you laid it all out, so we're done here. Thanks, everyone. No, just kidding. I want to take a step back, and I want to tackle this question above the momentary sort of political back and forth, and then dig into the political back and forth. When we have this debate in Israel about whether the court, one of the striking things about our debate about our Supreme Court, about our judicial reform more generally, is that everybody is right. And what do I mean by that? When the Israeli right wing lays out the case, as you just did, the first half of your talk just now was the right-wing case, that our own Barak overstepped massively and created judicial powers, judicial overreach in terms of standing, justiciability, just 1,000 different things that are unprecedented in the Western world. There's no court of anybody on this call from any other country that has the powers the Israeli court claims for itself. And so when the right comes and says that, you kind of have to sit there and say, look, there are facts here. The right has a real serious point. And then the left comes and says something else, which is also very profoundly true, which is that we have almost no other institutions. We do not have a second House of Parliament. We don't have regional election, which is a way for members of parliament in Britain, for example, to be slightly more independent of their party leader than in Israel. The vast majority of Israeli members of Knesset are literally appointed by their party leader without even a primary process within the party. And so in Israel, when you magnify the power of the unified sort of executive legislative, because the government in a parliamentary system is by definition, this is something you have to explain slowly to Americans, but other people understand it. In Europe, for example, where most systems are parliamentary systems, the executive and legislative are the same people usually. And so, but nevertheless, in Israel, not only are they the same people, most of the people in the Knesset literally work for most of the people in the cabinet. And so you don't have a division. And so if you weaken the Israeli court, there is nothing else. There's only an executive government, right? And so both of them are right. We have the most powerful court in the world, in the free world. I guess outside the free world, courts don't matter as much. So in the world. And at the same time, if we weaken it, which arguably is the healthy thing to do, you have argued in this very call, we have nothing else. We have no other checks and balances. Right. And so I want you to tell us something about stepping beyond Yariv Levin. Is he a fanatic? Is the end of democracy coming? Is it all collapsing? We don't have a constitution, but not only a constitution, we don't even have institutions. We don't even have a culture of constitutional building or institution building. What do we need in this country? And once we know maybe what we need, we can have the rest of the discussion.
So first of all, as I said before, it's become very much a right-left issue in Israel, but it's not only the right that has been critical of judicial activism. You have many public figures and legal experts, such as former Justice Minister Daniel Friedman. He's not from the right. Daniel Friedman is a renowned Israeli legal scholar who also served, as I said, as Justice Minister under Ehud Olmert. He's extremely critical of judicial activism. He wrote a whole book on it, like a 500-page book where he really tears apart Aaron Barak and says this is complete nonsense. No court in the world, as you mentioned, has unilaterally grabbed so many powers without any public debate. And he's not from the right. So I'm saying the criticism comes mostly from the right, but not only. Now, to the question, what do we need? What I think we need, and what a lot of people in Israel have been suggesting for many years, is first of all, we need a public debate, which we never had. As I said, the constitutional revolution happened without any debate. We need a debate about, exactly where are we going to set the limits of judicial activism? How exactly are you going to regulate the powers of the Attorney General, et cetera, et cetera? And we need, ideally, we should need we should have a constitution, but it's not going to happen. So what we should have, which I think is more realistic, is another basic law that will, and we've been talking about it for many years, a basic law on the separation of powers that will say exactly, okay, in which conditions can the Supreme Court strike down legislation, with which type of majority in the court. Should it be a simple majority, a two-third majority? Should the Supreme Court also be able to strike down basic laws? Because this is also something I forgot to mention, is that in his legal decision, in his court decision of 1995, Aaron Barak basically said his whole theory, his whole doctrine, which he developed in his decision, was to say, okay, all the basic laws of the state of Israel constitute altogether a constitution. Even if the legislator was not aware of the fact that he was writing a constitution, I'm telling you, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, it's a constitution. So we, the court, have the power to strike down regular legislation that we deem contrary to this constitution, which we just declared. Fine. 2008, the Knesset passes a basic law called the nation state, which, by the way, when you look at this law, it's basically the equivalent of the preamble of most constitutions in European countries, but whatever. So a lot of people, it was a controversial law, a lot of people didn't like it, and they petitioned the court saying, strike down this law. Now, according to the court's own doctrine, right, this is a basic law. So you cannot strike it down because it's part of the Constitution. So you would have thought that the court would have told the petitioners, I'm sorry, but this is part of the Constitution. I can't touch it according to my own doctrine. Not at all. The court say, of course we'll look into it. What's the problem? We'll change our doctrine overnight. Absolutely no problem. Now, at the end of the day, the court did not strike down this law, but not because it said that according to our own doctrine, we cannot do that. It said we can do whatever we want. If we want to strike down a basic law, we'll do it. We just think this basic law is fine. But if we had thought otherwise, we would have stricken down. It's no problem. So that's why you also need this basic law on separation of power to say exactly, is the court entitled to strike down basic laws, yes or not? How many judges? And even on the override clause, right? So you have an override clause in Canada, but obviously one of the differences, and you mentioned it, Haviv, is that in Israel, except for the court, we don't have any counter powers. You don't have two houses of parliament, right? You don't have a presidential veto. We don't have a federal system. Members of Knesset are not elected. They're basically appointed, as you said. Even parties that have primaries, anybody who's familiar with primaries knows that those are fake elections. And you get the more you please the head of the party, the higher you get on the list. But we won't get into that. And so that's the only counter power. So if you say that, you know, the Knesset can re-legislate any law stricken down by the court with a simple majority of 61, so that the court is done. There's no more court anymore. You don't have any counter power. Since the government and the parliament is the same thing, because the parliament is the majority is controlled by the government. So it's the end of any breaks and balances. You don't have any counter power. What do you do when the government, you know, legislates something that is clearly unconstitutional, or make a decision that is clearly illegal? Where do you go? If the court can be override, if you can override the court with a simple majority, and also part of the reform is to completely cancel the the principle of reasonableness, of that the court won't be able to use that principle anymore. Now, there are many legal experts, such as Judge Noam Solberg, who is on the Supreme Court today, who think that the principle of reasonable and unreasonable should be limited to extreme cases. For example, I think we have to limit it, but not cancel it altogether. So if you cancel this principle, if the Knesset with a simple majority can repass legislation at will, so that's the end of all counter powers, and that's indeed no longer a real democracy.
So, Emmanuel, you have suggested in the past things like open lists, where when you come to vote, this exists in some Scandinavian countries, right? Where you come to vote at the ballot box, you vote for a party, but the vote for a party is essentially a primary vote, where you, on the back of the ballot or in some part of the ballot, you actually list by priority the people you prefer to be at the top of the list or the people at the bottom of the list, and that's how you build the party list. That's a way to create a kind of personal accountability of MKs, and therefore also liberate them a little bit from the very centralized way that it actually works in Israel. Maybe we need another House of Parliament. Maybe we need a different way of electing, some kind of regional system. Maybe we need a second court, a court which exists in many places in Europe, a constitutional court, and the highest appeals court not be the same 15 judges. There are all kinds of changes. These are all enormous changes, profound, fundamental changes. And so the more people I talk to in Israel, the more people where you sit and have a conversation that's longer than 10 minutes and you say to them, look, here's the rights argument. You can't really say that this court isn't unhealthy and problematic, not even on the very far left. And then you come to people and say, dear right-wingers, unless you're illiberal, unless you literally don't think that checks and balances and democracy and all those things are important, which everyone I know on the right does think they are, or pretends to, at least on television, there's a problem here with canceling that court, right, and leaving us with nothing else. And so we arguably need profound, fundamental reforms. The system that was created 75 years ago for a much smaller country, a much simpler country, isn't working today, arguably. And I haven't yet met an Israeli who disagrees with that basic premise. Is it possible? Politically,
again,
institutionally?
There's ideal reforms and realistic ones. So on paper, I have a lot of reforms that I can think of, but they have no prospect of being implemented because, having a full constitution, establishing a second house of parliament, these are very ambitious projects. And we have to be realistic because at the end of the day, if you want to implement such reforms, you need a majority in the Knesset. So you mentioned, for example, regional elections. Well, guess what? This was the dream of David Ben-Gurion. He wanted regional elections because in the first past the post system, like in America or in England, you generally end up with one party or two parties in parliament. In other words, it creates a two-party system de facto, even though you have other parties. But if you look at the House of Commons, for example, you have like 15 parties, but only two parties have an absolute majority and can constitute a government. You have like a couple of seats from small parties. So Ben-Gurion loved the idea because, let's say the truth, he was not the biggest Democrat in the world. He wanted efficiency before negotiations. He hated the fact that he had to build coalitions. So he wanted to drop the list proportional system that we have, and he wanted to have regional elections with first past the post, right? He even when he quit labor and he formed his own party, right? In 1963, I believe, Rafi was called. Like one of the top articles on his platform was to establish regional elections with first past the post system. So if Ben-Gurion, who had very strong powers as a prime minister and did not have to face an activist court at the time, was not able to pass this reform in a much smaller Israel when Mapai had a very strong power, good luck today. The truth of the matter is that small and middle-sized parties have no incentive and no interest in committing suicide by passing a reform that would basically eliminate them from the political map. And so let's be realistic, it's never going to happen, which is why—
Yeah. So let me just focus that in then just quickly, and then we'll wrap up and take questions from the audience. Can we focus in on reforms that would not involve Knesset members voting themselves out of a job, which I agree with you is a bad way to try to push realistic. For example, doubling the size of the Knesset or adding a Knesset, a second house.
I said before, for example, instead of going for a full constitution, let's have a basic law on the separation of powers. Instead of going for regional elections, let's create a system where you do have accountability. You mentioned, for example, that I've proposed. I mean, it's not— I didn't make it up. It's not only my idea. It's actually in most in most parliamentary democracies where you have proportional elections, like in most European countries, voters are able to select their own candidates on the list. It's called open list. It's the most accepted model in Western democracy. Israel actually belongs to a minority of democracies where the list of the party you vote for is imposed to you as a voter by the party. So when you have an open list, you can select people you want to reward or to punish, and this creates some kind of accountability between members of parliament and voters. I would say even more than in regional election, actually, because yes, in regional election, you choose your own candidate, but statistics and research shows that about 90% of voters vote for a party before they vote for a candidate in district elections, because especially in parliamentary democracies, you're not going to cross the lines just because you hate your representative. You're going to swallow if you don't like him or her, because at the end of the day, if you're a conservative voter in England, you're not going to vote for a Labour candidate just because you hate your conservative representative. So
political identity trumps candidates in most
not only
places.
identity, like you don't want, let's say you're from the right or from the left, you don't want the other side to form the government just because you think your representative is an idiot, right? So most people are not going to do it. So this kind of shows that the accountability in this case is not real, even though, you know, your representative has, you know, reception hours every week or every month, and you can go there, etc., which you don't have in the Knesset. But at the end of the day, I think you do actually have more accountability with open lists than with regional elections. Now, a second House of Parliament might be a good idea, but I think it's also too ambitious. I think, on the other hand, there's definitely room to expand the number of members of Knesset. We went from 600,000 people to 9 million people, and we have the same members
with the same size parliament.
Exactly. Yeah. So definitely, I think the size of the parliament should be expanded, and this is realistic. It's something that can be achieved. But there should be a package deal. There should be a debate.
Are we going there? Are we going to a negotiation? So, I ask you also. You know the people involved. Right. You know. You also. I have worked with the Kohelet people who this is an important conservative think tank in Israel that's pushed a lot of these, and Yariv Levin and people like that. And I talk to them and I say to them, does Yariv Levin really plan on shutting down basically the Israeli court's ability to rein in the Knesset and executive in every way and leave nothing standing? And they say, no, this is his negotiating position. He's starting in an extreme so that he gets pulled by the negotiation to the center. And then I ask his people and they say, nope, this is what he believes and has been saying for 20 years. Is this the beginning of a negotiating process, or are the demonstrators right to believe that Yariv Levin is a little more fanatical than his people maybe suggest? And actually this needs to be fought in the street, so to speak.
So you're right. I know the people. I know these people. I was with Kohelet for many years until 2 months ago when I quit, among other things, because I disagreed with what they were promoting with legislation. Even within Kohelet, I mean, I can't give you names because many of them are friends, but not all of them agree with what's going on with the current proposals of the current coalition. There are different opinions there also. But I know Yariv Levin well. And I can tell you that anybody can die before they're able to change his mind. Like,
that is his reputation.
I know him well. Go and try to change his mind. Forget it. I know him well. You will never change his mind on anything. And it's not only that. Let's say it clearly. It's Yariv Levin has been talking about this for 20 years, and now he just feels that he's hit the jackpot with this majority, which was unexpected, and now he's Minister of Justice. So he's been talking about it for 20 years. He thinks he hit the jackpot. He's not going to let it go away. Same thing with Simcha Rotman, who is the chair of the Constitution and Law Committee in the Knesset. He's also somebody who's been written and talking about these issues for very many years. And he feels that he finally has the opportunity to implement all the things he's been talking about. Yariv Levin and Simcha Rotman do not want to rebalance the relation between the court and the government. They literally want to replace one hierarchy with another one. I'm convinced about it.
So we're dealing with true believers, and you would
Yes.
say that we're not
Yes.
going to see a good resolution. We're not going to see a compromise process of the
I
sort
don't
that the
believe it.
president
I
wants.
don't believe it, even though the president has been working very hard to try and reach a compromise. But people like Yariv Levin and Simcha Rotman are not people who will compromise on this. Now, at the end of the day, of course, it doesn't only depend on them, but on their boss. And that is the prime minister. And he's the one who will decide if whether or not those reforms will be implemented the way they're being proposed, or if there will be a compromise. And that depends on him at the end of the day. What are his intentions? It's hard to tell because, Netanyahu is on record, literally, and you're welcome to look it up on Google. He's literally on record saying that for his 12 years, I mean, this was an interview he gave a couple of years ago. For the 12 years he was prime minister, he prided himself of having personally blocked any attempt to reform the judicial system and to undermine the independence of the court. So he goes on and on and on in those interviews about how proud he is. He's a proud believer in a strong court, in an independent court. He said, even changing the way judges are appointed, no way. Public audition of judges, no way, nothing. And that was like before he was indicted. Once he became indicted, suddenly he has a problem with the judicial system. And that is where, basically he's
That's where you pin that's the political source of the reform.
Of course.
In your view.
The man for 15 years has been priding himself of personally blocking any attempt to reform the system. Even the reforms brought by Gideon Sa'ar, for example, changing the way compromise has to be made in the
selection committee, in the judicial selection.
And even that he tried to stop it. Or if you take, for example, another proposal that has been proposed by, for example, by Gideon Sa'ar or by Daniel Friedman, who say, for example, that the powers of the Attorney General, he has too many powers because he's altogether the legal advisor of the government, but he's also the public prosecutor. So he sits at the government meetings. He, on the one hand, advises ministers about what is legal and what is not, but he's also the one who decides who is going to be indicted or not. So a lot of legal experts for many years have said that his power should be separated. There should be two separate jobs, for example. Again, a perfectly legitimate debate in a democracy. Netanyahu has blocked those reforms during all his years as prime minister. Now, suddenly, he's in favor of them because he wants, and he already has a plan to separate those powers, to have the prosecutor being separated from the Attorney General. And he even knows who to appoint as the next prosecutor, his own lawyer, who will look at the cases against Netanyahu and say, well, let me look at it again. I'm suspending the whole thing because I don't think it has any legal basis. So, of course, it's motivated by his trouble. And that's part of the problem. How can you reform the powers of the Attorney General when you yourself are indicted?
How can you even have a conversation when the other side suspects that that's your motive and not a constitutional debate? I want to